At the edge of the known galaxy, hidden from every chart, lies a world where the sky churns with a storm that never ends, and the surface stretches out as cracked black stone, lit only by the restless flicker of lightning. Any ship that drifts too close is swallowed by a red zone of exotic space that tears it apart before it can turn back. Beneath that storm, deep underground, a mountain of kyber crystal waits in the dark, and around it, in vaults that seem to have no bottom, thousands of star destroyers are being built in silence. This is Exegol, and by the time anyone in the galaxy realizes it exists, the fleet is almost ready to fly. Decades earlier, on Coruscant, a polite senator from Naboo was shaking hands with people whose names no one bothered to remember. That senator was Chief Palpatine, and long before he ever wore the title of Emperor, he was already building a second government no one could see. The trouble with a project nobody can see is that nobody can save it either. It was a contradiction Palpatine spent his life refining one half of, and never solved the other. On the surface, he looked like any other rising politician, skilled in conversation, careful in alliance, and at ease in the public world of the Senate. Beneath that image, however, he was already linked to clandestine networks of bankers, financiers, and industrialists from the galaxy's most important sectors. These were not political allies in the ordinary sense. Their names appeared on no Senate roll, and none of them held a seat in the Chancellor's cabinet. They were instead the quiet backbone of the galactic economy, and their loyalty ran to him personally rather than to any office or institution. Nothing about the network was written down in a single place, and nothing about it could be traced from one end to the other. Each project he ever undertook from that point forward would be a larger version of the same idea, the same shadow network applied to a heavier task. The clone army would be the first test, the Death Star would be the second, Exegol would be the third, the largest, and the last. The Clone Wars taught Palpatine a lesson that would shape every secret project he ever undertook. He learned that if anyone wanted to build something enormous without being detected, the problem was never raw materials. The real problem was always information. When the Kaminoans began growing the clone army, no identifiable figure in the galaxy was funding them directly. Instead, Palpatine funneled untold billions in credits from the Republic's own budgets through a maze of intermediaries. By the time the credits reached Kamino, no single auditor in the Senate could reconstruct the trail. The warships for that army were built the same way. In Legends, according to the Essential Guide to Warfare, Kuat Drive Yards took the contract through its subsidiary, Rathana Heavy Engineering. Rathana itself was a hidden world in wild space, accessible only through encrypted coordinates downloaded from a secure beacon. Non-KDY ships were not permitted to visit. The director of KDY received a contract whose true buyer did not exist on paper. Billions arrived on schedule, and no one on the company side ever met the customer. Palpatine learned something else during those years, this time about the workforce itself. The clones he ordered from Kamino were engineered so that loyalty was written into their genes, and they were conditioned from birth to follow orders without debate. After the Republic fell and the Empire rose, the same principles moved to a larger scale. By the time the Death Star was under construction, the secrecy doctrine had become a science. In James Luceno's Tarkin, the battle station is presented as a clandestine Imperial operation managed through remote installations, restricted circles of scientists and engineers, and tightly controlled access to information. On the surface, the Death Star was the Emperor's great project, but in practice, no one held the complete picture, and no base commander could view all the cargo manifests, schedules, or progress reports. Palpatine's visits to the site were rare and spaced out, and even the Imperial Council, which relayed his orders, was never quite sure how much of the plan had ever reached them in full. Millions of beings across the galaxy were involved in building it, each kept in the dark about where their contributions would end up. Wilf Tarkin, who commanded Sentinel Base and hundreds of guards and resupply outposts around the build site for 3 years, understood the shape of what he was looking at. The Imperial Security Bureau and Naval Intelligence worked constantly to smother rumors and close off leaks, and the continuous suppression of information formed a standing line item in the project's budget. Palpatine went further. using phantom projects and shell budgets to hide the real construction beyond official records. Inside that maze, another project was already taking shape, one almost no one in the Empire could even name. Palpatine had chosen this world with care. The statue in its underground citadel was older than the cultists who now lived there. It had been raised not by them or their ancestors, but by other people in another age, now long forgotten. For thousands of years, the mythology of the dark side had settled into the stone itself. No other religion had to be built on Exegol because one was already waiting within its walls. At the center of the citadel, his followers found the mountain. It held kyber crystal in quantities great enough to power weapons on a galactic scale. They began to cut into it. Slowly, beneath the long shadow of the storms above, the work began. At some point during the height of the Empire, Darth Vader himself went to see it. He did not go alone. He brought Uchi of Bestoon with him as an unwilling witness. After crossing the Red Honeycomb Zone, they reached Exegol and found the work already underway. The cultists and their enslaved laborers were building Star Destroyers by the hundreds, each one stronger than an Imperial warship and fitted with a cannon powered by kyber cut from the mountain beneath the temple. When the crystals were torn free, the released energy seared the skin from Uchi's skull and burned out his eyes. The cultists rebuilt him with replacements and fitted him with a cybernetic head unit to compensate for the damage. Even if he had spoken of what he saw, no one would have believed him. The cultists on Exegol call themselves the Sith Eternal. Their faces were obscured beneath deep hoods, robed figures who spent their lives in vaults that the rest of the galaxy did not know existed. The accounts of those who later stood among them described a population of true believers in the dark side of the Force, devoting every waking hour to the cause. Every routine task they performed was wrapped in ritual. The cultists were not always sure they were chanting alone. As they walked the vaults, voices rose on the names of Sith Lords long dead, Plagueis, Revan, names older still, and in the echoes, it sometimes sounded as though other voices, from the catacombs below, were answering back. As the reactor shaft opened beneath them, Palpatine reached for the dark side with everything he had and sent his consciousness across the void, towards the only place ever prepared to receive it. On Exegol, the cult had been waiting for this for decades. A body lay ready in the labs beneath the citadel, and then he arrived. But the moment came too soon. The hidden world had not finished its preparations. The body was unfinished, the procedures untested, the transfer succeeded, and the transfer failed. Palpatine was left trapped in a ruined, dying form, suspended above the citadel floor by an omen harness, old enough that even the cultists no longer remembered when its first version had been built. Tubes of regeneration fluid fed into his neck, preserving him a little longer with each pulse. The Sith Eternal worked with greater urgency. They spliced more genes and reinforced more tissue, but most of what they made did not survive. One strain cast lived and even flourished, raised within the Citadel as a son, though he grew up without power and was treated as a disappointment. The galaxy would later know him only as the father of Rey. The failed bodies in the vaults were the same fragility that would later appear in the fleet above, written first into flesh. Outside Exegol, the galaxy had decided the war was over. In a cantina somewhere on the rim, Lando Calrissian heard the same kind of whisper he had been chasing for years. He was searching for his daughter, taken by the First Order as a child, and the rumors he kept finding spoke of armies built not from clones or volunteers, but from children stolen and brainwashed into cannon fodder for a war that had not yet come. The signal was there. Nobody was positioned to listen for it. The New Republic had demilitarized. Planetary security forces had been returned to local authorities, and the standing fleet was much larger than the old Republic's judicials, but far smaller than the Imperial Starfleet it had just replaced. What intelligence apparatus remained had turned inward, picking apart Imperial warlord holdings in the core. Almost nobody was looking at the unknown regions. Lando's whispers reached people who could have understood. None believed in it strongly enough to act. In Exegol, 2 decades passed without sun or season, only lightning, ritual, and the quiet clang of work in the vaults. Children were raised beneath the surface of Exegol from birth. One of them would later stand on the bridge of an advanced Star Destroyer, having spent 20 years preparing for a single assignment: the command of the first ship to emerge into a wider galaxy. Around her stood officers raised on Exegol, officers from other unknown regions' worlds, and crimson-clad troopers conscripted as children and quietly called into the roles by spies who identified their potential. There were thousands like them on Exegol. This was the true labor force behind the fleet. Not a payroll, but a congregation. Beyond Exegol, in galactic space, a separate supply chain kept the project fed. A Final Order general named Enric Pride, who would serve the Empire as a young officer and remain loyal to Palpatine in secret long after its fall, had quietly brokered a deal with the Corporate Sector Authority. The CSA, a galaxy-scale operation, was bankrolling the Imperial Remnant under orders that came from the highest level. The deal had been struck in a tent on a cold planet decades earlier, signed under the name Steadfast, the same word Pride would later watch painted on the hull of his command ship. The arrangement was fragile, liable to collapse over a single credit, yet while it held it, formed a distributed funding pipeline that reached deep into the galactic economy and fed the fleet without ever leaving its name on a document. From Exegol, ships moved through hidden spaceports in the unknown regions, where beings from 100 species labored without ever being told what they were building. It was the Death Star principle scaled down and pushed deeper into the void. Then, the galaxy heard a voice that should not have existed. Palpatine, or something bearing his voice, spoke again. Generations of hidden work had reached completion, and the moment the Sith had waited for had arrived. Within the Resistance, the intelligence officer Beaumont worked to interpret the ancient phrasing, tracing it to dark science, cloning, and older Sith practices. Inside the First Order, Kylo Ren followed the voice he had heard in his mind for most of his life. The Wayfinder was the only key. Long before the Empire fell, Palpatine had hidden 2 of these compass stones across the galaxy, each one carrying the route through the Red Honeycomb Zone. Without one, no ship could find Exegol. Kylo recovered his grandfather's Wayfinder on Mustafar and crossed the storm to reach the planet. For decades, no outsider had set foot on Exegol uninvited. The system had been built to refuse contact with the galaxy at every layer: navigation, supply, ideology, and biology. Kylo's arrival was the first breach, and it had not come through any of those layers. It had come through the Force, the one channel the secrecy doctrine could not block. The wall around Exegol had finally been crossed, and from this point forward, the system would never again be fully sealed. When he arrived at Exegol, the surface of the planet shook and split open. A metal hull striped with red erupted from the ground. Around it, more mountains broke apart, and more hulls emerged, each one a Star Destroyer comparable in scale to the Imperial warships of old, but each carrying an axial superlaser cannon powered by Kyber. A single giant obelisk rose with them, a navigation tower built to coordinate a synchronized ascension, its array unfurling like a metal flower as the rest of the fleet filled the atmosphere behind it. Inside the Citadel, Kylo Ren saw that the fleet above Exegol was the finished shape of Palpatine's return. To prove the threat, Palpatine ordered a single Star Destroyer to break from the fleet and destroy Kijimi. The cannon fired, and the planet collapsed into ice and molten stone, while the broadcast announcing the final order spread across known space. On worlds far from the unknown regions, the message arrived without warning. In cantinas and command centers, in market squares and orbital stations, the same voice spoke from speakers that had not carried it in a generation. Some who heard it were old enough to remember the original Empire and froze where they stood. Others, born into the years of the New Republic, did not recognize the voice but understood the tone. Within hours, survivors who had been off-world during the strike confirmed that Kijimi was gone, and that the Resistance and Ajan Kloss began plotting a course built around coordinates that had been recovered from a dying friend on Pasana. Every ship in the fleet carried the power to erase a world, and yet the fleet itself was not free. Exegol storms disoriented navigation so completely that the destroyers could not find their own way out of the atmosphere. To leave the planet at all, every vessel in the Armada had to follow a single guidance signal broadcast from a single tower planted beside the Citadel. That was the opening. A transport carrying Finn, Janna, and a strike team broke through the upper atmosphere riding the hull of a Resistance bomber. then peeled off as the larger ship engaged Pride's escorts. They landed on the dorsal spine of a rising Star Destroyer, where the navigation array had been mounted along the open deck. From there, mounted on orbaks brought from the moon of Kevbir, they crossed the hull under fire from Sith troopers and reached the cluster of conduits that fed the beacon. A ground team reached the tower and destroyed it. The signal that bound the fleet together cut out at once, and across Exegol, Star Destroyers dropped into standby and hung motionless above the storm. Thousands of warships suspended on a signal that no longer existed. Pride tried to recover control by routing the signal through his own command ship. By then, the sky over Exegol was filled with vessels that should never have been able to find the planet at all. What had changed the calculus was not the resistance fighters that had crossed the red honeycomb zone in the first wave. It was the second wave, the one no model in the Final Order's commands had accounted for. In the hours before the battle, Lando Calrissian had taken the Falcon out across the galaxy and called in every debt and favor he had built up over 4 decades of trying. The reply came in numbers nobody could have forecast. Freighters from the Outer Rim, mining haulers retrofitted with surplus turrets, private yachts with hunting rifles welded to their nose cones, a civilian craft from worlds whose populations had spent 40 years quietly hating the Empire's memory. They came down through the storm in a single uneven line, stretching past the horizon, and the Final Order's gunners did not have firing solutions for any of them. He understood what that meant. By moving the beacon onto the Steadfast, Pride was telling every Resistance pilot in the sky exactly which ship to aim at. The fleet was already lost. He kept giving the order anyway. Fighters and freighters arrived from every corner of the galaxy, and within minutes, the fleet that had been built in absolute secrecy was being torn apart by an armada of strangers. Star Destroyers collided in the upper atmosphere, the Kyber Mountain shuddered beneath the Citadel as the structure above it gave way, and the fleet that had taken a generation to assemble began to fall in a single afternoon. Below the surface, in the audience chamber where the Sith Eternal had gathered to witness their master's restoration, the chanting changed pitch. Robed figures who had spent decades in those vaults felt the floor shift beneath them as detonations from the surface rolled down through the stone. The apparatus that pumped fluid into Palpatine's neck began to falter as the chamber's power feeds collapsed one by one. Rey faced him at the foot of the altar, and the voices of every Jedi who had ever lived spoke through her in a single answering line. Poe watched the wreckage come down from the cockpit of his X-Wing. With it went the illusion that Palpatine's return had ever been inevitable. Somewhere under the collapsing stone and twisted metal, the omen harness that had held him in place had finally gone quiet. The cultists who survived the collapse scattered into the catacombs that ran beneath the Citadel, and the strand casts and the cloning vats broke apart in their tanks as the climate system shut down. The Kyber Mountain, exposed for the first time in decades by the rupture of the chamber above it, glowed faintly under the lightning before the next quake brought a section of ceiling down across its summit. No accounting was ever made of the laborers who had been brought to Exegol against their will, or the officers raised from birth to cruise ships that no longer existed. Both halves of the design failed at the same time. Above, the fleet. Below, the body. Both collapsed in the same hour. The Resistance only walked through a door that had already been built into the design. The man who could not be found had built a world that could not save him. If you want the full shape of the man behind all of this, from the quiet senator on Coruscant to the figure suspended in the harness on Exegol, that story is already waiting on the channel. And if you've ever wondered why the galaxy needed a war at all, why clones, why then, why him, the answer is less about strategy and more about something he'd been planning long before the first shot was fired. Either one is a good place to keep going. Subscribe so the next one finds you.